Greetings again everyone. I've just released a full review of a very important new little lens, the Canon RF 50mm f1.8 STM, which is exclusively for their mirrorless EOS R cameras. If Canon gets their way, it will eventually end up selling in massive quantities, like their previous Nifty 50 lens, the EF 50mm f1.8 STM, which is for digital SLR cameras. In designing a new RF version of the lens with slightly different optics, were Canon able to make any improvements to the original lens's optical quality, which has remained more or less unchanged for about 30 years now? And is the newer lens's build quality any better? Well, let's see. By the way, there are links to my original reviews of these two lenses in the description below, as well as affiliate links if you'd like to buy one of them, which helps to support this channel. Now, both of these lenses offer nice photographic potential for a low price, but still, the new RF version of the lens costs about twice as much as the EF version. But then again, there's no price difference really if you take into account the cost of Canon's EF to RF mount adapter that you would have to buy in order to use the older, cheaper model. That adapter will cost you about £100, remember? And although it works perfectly well, it'll certainly make your camera setup a lot bigger. So, despite the extra cost, a lot of people will probably automatically prefer to go with the RF lens. The build quality of both lenses is remarkably similar. They're virtually the same size, well, without the EF to RF mount adapter that is, and they each weigh 160 grams. They each have a metal lens mount, but no weather sealing. However, the newer RF lens does feel just a little more solid than the older lens in your hand, and I think its design looks a little bit nicer too. The focus ring of the new lens is much smoother to turn than that of the older version, which is also very prone to getting clogged up by dirt. The RF lens's focus ring can also work as a control ring for your aperture, ISO, exposure compensation, or all kinds of other things. But the RF lens doesn't have an auto to manual focus switch, which means that if you want to use manual focus exclusively, you'll have to switch it to manual focus in your camera's menu system, which is a little fiddly. Both lenses appear to have exactly the same STM focus motor. They each work just slightly slowly and with an audible but not loud buzzing sound. Both lenses exhibit focus breathing, which is a minor annoyance for video makers, and even when focusing manually, both of them have motors that make enough noise for your camera's microphone to pick up their sound when you're working them. Neither lens has image stabilization. The newer RF lens has a smaller filter thread size though, of only 43mm versus the larger 49mm of the EF lens, so you might be able to save $1 or $2 on smaller filters. But really, overall, the build quality of both these lenses, and particularly their focus motors, are remarkably similar. Well, let's take a look at image quality now. I'm testing both lenses on a Canon EOS R5 here with its 45MP full frame sensor. At f1.8, both lenses are similarly sharp in the middle of the image, although perhaps the RF lens just has a little edge of contrast over the older lens. Over in the corner of your images, both lenses see a great deterioration in their image quality, although the newer lens, again, does seem to exhibit just a tiny bit less ghosting, a tiny bit more contrast. Let's drop down to f2.8. Now, the difference in contrast between the two lenses is a little clearer, although it's still hardly dramatic. Back in the middle of the image, they both look about the same, brilliantly sharp. It's the same story in the middle at f4, and over in the corners the lenses are still close, but the RF lens has just a small edge over the older model. At f5.6, both lenses are brilliantly sharp from corner to corner, but once again, I think the RF lens has the tiniest advantage imaginable, right in the very edges. Both lenses stay this sharp down to about f16, where the effects of diffraction begin to really soften the image. Well, the newer RF lens's optics include an aspherical element that the older lens does not have, which does tend to lead to improved contrast, and that's what we're seeing here. Both of them offer a similarly typical performance for an inexpensive double Gauss design 50mm lens, but the newer lens does indeed seem to have an edge of extra contrast in its image corners. When it comes to distortion and vignetting, if you turn your in-camera corrections off, then you can see that the newer lens projects considerably less barrel distortion than the older design does. However, at f1.8, to me, the vignetting looks just a little worse, although the difference is small. Stop down to f2.8 or f4 to see that vignetting go away to about the same level on both lenses. Let's compare the close-up image quality now. The newer RF lens can focus about 5 cm closer than the older lens, which is pretty impressive for shooting smaller subjects. At f1.8, both lenses look pretty soft when shooting close up with very low contrast. Stop down to f2.8 and f4 to see broadly equivalent improvements, with both lenses eventually becoming very sharp as you stop down. Let's see how they both work against bright light. Both lenses exhibit rather strong flaring and a loss in contrast, although the flaring pattern between them is a bit different. Now let's take a look at chroma levels. At f1.8, both lenses produce chroma smearing when faced with bright points of light in the edges of your images, although it's a little worse with the older lens. Stop down to f2.8 and it's almost gone on the newer lens, but still noticeable on the older one, and here's f4. So in this field also, the newer lens slightly outperforms the older design. Now let's take a look at the quality of both lenses' bokeh. It really is the same for both lenses here, somewhat awkward looking bokeh with some outlining at normal distances, although deeply out of focus backgrounds do look smooth enough. And finally, related to bokeh is longitudinal chromatic aberration. I'll spare you the deep analysis and just tell you it's virtually the same on both lenses, showing colourful highlighting at f1.8 and f2.8 also. Overall then, well, as you'll have noticed, the differences between the lenses are pretty small, but in a number of areas, the newer RF lens does perform a little better. Its build quality feels a touch more solid, and its extra functionality with a control ring could be useful for some people. You don't have to use an adapter to get it onto your mirrorless camera either, and its image quality shows a tiny bit more contrast, a little less distortion, a little less chroma, and what's more, it can focus closer to your subject, which is fun. For all those little improvements, you have to pay an extra $100 for it in the US or £100 extra for it in the UK. Although, if you're wanting to buy the older lens, then the EF to RF mount adapter you'll have to buy will negate that difference anyway, as I mentioned before. So I think that most people will be happy to pay for the newer lens, but you really must bear in mind that the improvements it brings are only slight.